Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Michael Ayala. Amber Heard's team called their first witness today, psychologist Dr. Dawn Hughes. Now, she spent more than 20 hours with Heard examining her. Now, Dr. Hughes' testimony actually turned out to be obviously very different from Dr. Shannon Curry, who was an expert witness for Johnny Depp's team. So let's first take a listen to Dr. Hughes' testimony from today about intimate partner violence.
And what did the evaluation consist of?
So as I stated, the evaluation consisted of psychological testing, a semi-structured clinical interview with Ms. Heard, a review of a whole host of documents relative to this case and medical records and psychological records, and then 3 collateral interviews, 2 with her treating therapist, Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, Dr. Connell Cohen, and also with her mom.
And in the semi-structured clinical interview, what were you assessing?
Well, when someone comes in for the evaluation, you sometimes don't know what you're going to see or what you're going to get. So you absolutely have to do a full clinical interview and have a sense of their life patterns, things that have affected them in their lives, you know, where they have worked, where they have lived, just get a full sense of their sort of being before the incident for which they're talking about. Then I do a full intimate partner violence assessment, looking at all those characteristics that I talked to you about earlier to get a sense of the full structure of and the dynamic of this relationship. I also did looking at what were the effects, what were the psychological consequences of being in that relationship. And I also looked at the psychological consequences of some of the statements that were made by Mr. Depp through his attorney that are part of this, the counterclaim in this lawsuit.
At the end of that process, considering all the data, did you arrive at any expert opinions?
Yes, I did.
All right, I would like to start with your main expert opinions and then go through those. Can you please tell the jury what your main opinions were?
So like I said, there are opinions embedded within them, but the main opinion is that Ms. Heard's report of intimate partner violence and the records that I reviewed is consistent with what we know in the field about intimate partner violence, characterized by physical violence, psychological aggression, sexual violence, coercive control, and surveillance behaviors.
And what was the other main opinion that you had?
The second main opinion was that that Ms. Heard demonstrated very clear psychological and traumatic effects or the exacerbation of trauma from those statements that Mr. Depp made through his attorney. There were 3 statements that we evaluated to see how they affected her emotionally and psychologically, and it was my determination that they did.
And did you arrive at any diagnostic conclusions?
Yes, I did.
And what were those?
I diagnosed Ms. Heard with post-traumatic stress disorder.
And what, if any, etiology was associated with the post-traumatic stress disorder?
So the etiology is the cause. In order to have to meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, you have to have an actual cause. It's one of the few diagnostic entities that we have to have a cause for, and the cause was the intimate partner violence by Mr. Depp. That was what was pushing the symptoms. That was what's related to the intrusive phenomena. That was related to her avoidance. That was related to her differences in her mood, that was related to her avoidance efforts. So it was the cause was the intimate partner violence by Mr. Depp.
All right, now earlier in the trial, Dr. Shannon Curry, who you'll see her there, she was actually spotted in the gallery today, listening to Dr. Hughes' testimony, she diagnosed Amber Heard with 2 personality disorders.
As a result of the work that you performed, did you form any opinions with respect to Ms. Heard?
I did.
What were those opinions?
The results of Ms. Heard's evaluation supported 2 diagnoses, borderline personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder.
Now, Dr. Curry also addressed whether Heard suffers from PTSD.
There are 20 kind of core symptoms that somebody can manifest with PTSD. You don't have to have all of them. Ms. Heard initially said that she had in the first question, you say, do you ever have this, before you get to the more nuanced follow-up questions. When I asked that first question on each item, she initially said, yes, I have that, to 19 of the 20 symptoms. That's not typical even of somebody with the most disabling form of PTSD. When we eventually sort of dialed it down, she had 3 remaining symptoms. And having symptoms of any disorder is common for all of us. Some of us struggle with sleep. Some of us get anxious. It could be several different disorders. It could just be that you have this struggle in your life. But she had 3 specific symptoms that I scored as present. Off the top of my head, I might miss one, but one was sleep disturbance. So she reported that she has frequent nightmares. Another one was that she said that she tends to have a startle response. So if she gets startled or surprised, she tends to stay in sort of a hyper startle mode for quite a while. And that's consistent with a couple of things. It can be consistent with PTSD if other criteria are met. It's also consistent with childhood complex trauma, which is something that can occur when your brain is forming. If you constantly feel unsafe, if your parents are abusive, or if they're not present, if you're neglected, you can develop certain physiological responses that can stay for a long time in your life. So I noted that seemed like a very genuine, accurate account where she stays in the state of kind of hyper arousal, has a hard time calming down if she gets surprised.
You mentioned nightmares as well.
Yes.
Did she recount for you the nature of the nightmares?
So they were vague. She indicated that she has recurrent nightmares and that she feels as though she's being held down. And there was some conflict in that account because even though that could be a PTSD symptom, it is fairly vague, but I still scored it as present. And in her initial treatment with with Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, which I believe started before she began dating Mr. Depp, she had indicated to Dr. Jacobs, according to Dr. Jacobs's notes, that she was having repetitive nightmares back then and that they were related to her childhood trauma. And so that came up several times in the notes. Dr. Jacobs kept mentioning that.
Thank you. What is feigning?
Feigning is essentially faking or exaggerating symptoms that aren't present.
Does the CAPS-5 control for that?
It doesn't necessarily control for it. It can expose it by drawing out
How does that work?
Because you're not just simply handing the person a checklist that says, here are all the symptoms of PTSD. Why don't just check off the ones you have, which clearly if you're trying to look like you have PTSD, you would just check them all. The CAPS-5, because it requires them to describe in detail how they experience the symptom, where it shows up, what it looks like, what sort of examples they can give you, how many times it's happened in the last couple of weeks, how many times it's happened in the last month. By the end of each symptom, you've gotten a very good picture of a couple things. One, does it meet the definition of the symptom? Are they getting it right? Is this actually the symptom, or are they kind of confusing this with something else? Number 2, are they giving you very vague accounts? Are they giving you kind of a stereotyped idea of what the symptom is based on media or movies or something that actually is completely different from genuine experiences of this symptom? Or are they giving you a very genuine, heartfelt, sometimes minimizing, but it's ticking all the boxes, their mannerisms while they're describing it, the actual very specific, very nuanced, symbolic ways they're describing it. A lot of times it smells, it sounds, that all appears in genuine accounts, and it's something that people really get wrong when they're feigning.
All right, still with me, former homicide prosecutor Melba Pearson. And Melba, gosh, they both sound so credible, quite frankly. I'm listening to both. They both make sense. I know you've had many, many cases where you have a battle of the experts. What are you looking for? Or how do you separate your expert from the other expert?
So one of the things that I always liked to do when I was trying cases was to make sure that my expert is really giving context to some of the evidence that's coming out in the trial and really referring back to different things that the jury hears. I tend to like to call my experts a little bit later in the trial, not necessarily leading with them, because I like to get a little bit of evidence in first and then have the expert kind of explain that context to the jury so that they're like, oh, connect the dots. Okay, I understand what this expert is saying and how this fits into the broader case. I think in this instance, I'm not saying that it was wrong for the defense to necessarily start with the expert, because again, we heard so much coming out of the plaintiff's case. But again, I think the goal here is to try to really lay the foundation for Amber Heard's testimony and for the powerful stories that she's going to end up sharing, because no matter which way you cut it, if she has to get into the personal details of what happened to her, and there's no way that she can get away from around doing that, it's going to be painful. It's going to be stressful for the jurors, as well as for Amber Heard, talking about traumatic experiences that may have happened to her and the effects that it's had on her to this day.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned the order of the witnesses, because initially the scuttlebutt was that Amber Heard would be the first witness. And then I think there was a change in strategy there. They decided to put the doctor on. I think it was a nod to the fact that this other expert had done a pretty good job on the stand. So ultimately, now that you've heard her direct examination, again, we still have to go through cross, do you think it was the right move to put her on before Amber Heard?
I think so. At this juncture, I think so. Of course, I'm going to want to see the rest of the witnesses and the evidence that comes out, and then I can opine better after seeing everyone. Okay, so-and-so should have been first versus this person. But I think at this juncture, having the doctor testify is a good way to rebut some of what the plaintiff's expert said. So I think in some ways that puts a little bit of distance and kind of signals to the jury, okay, wait a minute, there was more to hear here, there's more to see. Don't just, go with what this doctor's saying, listen to what our doctor's saying. And now you're going to hear from Amber Heard and hear her direct testimony and her pain.
Yeah, I agree. I think it just gives a whole new context to her testimony, which I think was needed after what we heard on Johnny Depp's case. Finally, what can you expect on cross tomorrow? I think it's going to be very aggressive, although they don't want to be too aggressive, right? This is a case where your own client is being charged with being aggressive. So you got to go at it, but you got to be extensive, I think.
Yeah, I think they're really going to try and hammer home the discrepancies with regards to maybe how Amber Heard presented certain incidents or certain things that happened to her over time. If there's been any discrepancies in how she's described symptoms or behaviors or anything like that. I think there's going to be some cross-examination with regards to the differences of the 3 symptoms of PTSD versus this doctor's viewpoint that there's many more symptoms of PTSD that led her to conclusively say that is what Amber Heard is suffering from. So I think there's going to be a lot of splitting hairs in some ways, and it may seem like, but it's going to show the differences in how they approach this examination and the review of all the documents and the evidence in this case.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more, and I bet Shannon Curry will have a lot to say in terms of helping them prepare for that cross-examination, because she was in that courtroom.